I'd like to call the Rules and City Government Committee meeting to order. Please note for the record, Alderman Arnett and Alderman Savage are in attendance. First item is approval of the agenda. I'll entertain a motion.
So move.
Second.
Okay, discussion. Hearing none, all in favor of approving the agenda as written, please say aye.
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 Okay, next item is approval of the minutes from the October 12th meeting.
Move approval of the minutes.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, discussion. Hearing none, all in favor of approving the minutes from the October 12th meeting as written, please say aye.
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 Okay, next item is discussion, legal opinion, the law department. Mr. Lyles, is Mr. Lyles with us?
Since that's happening, Madam Chair, if I could just ask about 03720, which is, where'd my agenda go?
03720?
That's not on our agenda.
Oh, it's ours. Okay. What am I looking at? Okay, never mind. I was just getting confused by another piece of legislation.
Oh, sorry. Mr. Lyles is logging on now. He just got off of another meeting.
Julian, do you have access to the items on the agenda? I'm looking at the annual statement of performance standards. It's about a 40-page document. I'm not sure what of that we may want displayed.
I don't right now, but I can pull it up.
Okay, just in case we need it when we get to that. I see Mr. Lyles has joined us. Welcome.
Good day. Good day, everyone. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Wonderful.
Okay, I'm going to ask the question that everybody's thinking, or maybe you all already know. Did you guys
Porcupine. No, what's the question?
Did your family win?
We won 3 games, but we didn't win fast money. No, we didn't win the big dollars.
Bummer.
We missed it by 3 points.
Ah, gee.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah.
Well, we all tried to watch and couldn't find it after the council meeting. Wow, and I saw just a snippet of it on, I guess, on Facebook or somewhere, where Steve Harvey gave your was that your son-in-law?
My brother, and my son-in-law and my brother were both there. So he played with both of them. So I don't really remember which one you're talking about, but he had a lot of fun with them.
We want to know what you're going to do to speed up the next council meeting.
Well, you know what? I think I'm going to go on another game show. I only have a few options.
I don't know whether any of the others are as lively as Steve Harvey's shows, though. I mean,
yeah, it's a good show. It's fun, very fun.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. And you keep good secrets, too.
Do my best. That's all in the show, in the game there.
Well, thank you for joining us. We have a discussion item on our agenda that deals with the role of the law department as it relates to the council, and of course the mayor, who's part of the council. Yep. And so, we have, I think, some, I don't want to say discrepancies, but misunderstandings as to all of our roles and the city code and what it says or, requires of us. Right. And so I guess what has brought this to light is the maritime, what is it? Can't think of.
The Board of Appeals?
Yeah, the Board of Appeals and the what is it? The wardens.
Port wardens.
And port wardens also, yeah.
Yes, that's
there are a few of the commissions and boards that have that kind of hearing opportunity. Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Ross.
I was going to say, I really want to start with first principles, and I sent everybody a copy of the charter. And in Article 1, General Provisions, the very first statement is Constitution as municipal body. The mayor and the aldermen of the city of Annapolis constitutes a municipal body, corporate and politic. I'd like to know what that means. In discussions with you and a recent one with Carrie, it was asserted that we have an executive and a legislative branch. I do not find that anywhere in the charter or the code, but I have to admit to you, I have what I think a municipal body, corporate and politic means. But I think that that's a very good place to start in sort of sorting out these roles. What does that mean?
Sure. Basically, in the state of Maryland, an entity can be organized along several types of codified structures, everything from a partnership to a corporation. The municipalities who want to be organized generally are going to comport their organization with the state requirement that they be incorporated. And there is a subset of incorporations called municipal corporations in the state of Maryland. A municipality under the state law, in order to be recognized as a state municipal corporation, has to be organized as such. So those words are arcane legal terms that basically separate out municipal corporations from commercial corporations. Municipal corporations under the state code have a lot of protections from being sued. They have a lot of authority and power to do things in the best interest of citizens who are like shareholders. Those activities are protected under a whole set of code, Maryland State Code, that governs how these municipal corporations are to handle their affairs. And so it's you're a corporation, but you're a separate, distinct type of corporation authorized by the state to engage in activities for the protection of welfare of citizens.
So in Article, well, thank you for that, although I'm still digesting it. I think I know what you told us, and what I'm taking away from that is that doesn't really talk about our form of governance, council manager versus executive legislative. That is not speaking to that. It's just distinguishing us from other forms of corporations.
Right. Most of what happens with respect to the distinctiveness of the operation occurs in your charter and in your code. Our charter sets out management in two ways. The corporate body politic can be managed and is managed under our charter and our code in two ways. One, by the executive, who is the city manager, who under the charter and the code, you've imbued with certain duties. And those duties, as you might see, are all laid out. The city manager has no other duties other than what is laid out in the charter and the code. So for instance, the city manager couldn't do things that are in your province. The city council have the powers and the duties laid out to it. Those are specified in your charter and code. As such, there can be no additional powers unless you empower yourself by a code or charter change, which you do from time to time, right?
Well, I want to get to that, sure. But sticking with Article 1, it says declarations of principles, and it says the making of policy is a matter for elected officials, the mayor, aldermen, and alderwomen, who are directly accountable to the voters. And I think that's a very important statement when we get into our representation in front of boards and commissions. But to me, it says we make the policy. When you go to various people like the position of city administrator or all the other positions, their job is to carry out the policy as set by the city council.
Exactly.
So that is a very clear delineation.
Right.
Council makes the policy, the staff, including the city manager, and to some extent, and this is where we're ambiguous, the mayor is the chief executive officer, and that kind of crosses over the duties of the city manager as it's set up in other places. But I just wanted to make that distinction clear. So then we go to Article 4, and it talks about the composition, and it talks about the city council, and it enumerates our powers and duties. And the first one is that we're the legislative body. The second one is powers and duties of the council shall include the power and duty to conduct oversight of the expenditure of public money, which I assume involves the budget, and delivery of municipal services. And that's where I think we need more definition.
Okay.
The next one says the city council shall sit as the planning and zoning authority for the city, except for those functions delegated to the Board of Appeals, Planning Commission, and Planning and Zoning Director. And there again, I think there's some ambiguity that we need help with. But then the final one says the city council shall perform such other functions as specified in its charter, as you said, or by ordinance, or as conferred upon local governing bodies by the laws of the state of Maryland. And that sounds like one of those big catch-all and anything else sorts of things. I don't know what else the state laws confer on municipal bodies.
Well, let me give you an example of what that means. You shall have no other authority unless the state gives it to you. The state has given you authority to tax certain kinds of things, but not all things.
Right.
It gives you the authority to have control of liquor board or liquor sales. But, so it gives you the authority over a lot of things, but that authority is explicitly stated in the code. So every time you want to do something as a council and you ask us, the first place we go to see is the code, the state code, to determine whether or not it's prohibited versus possibly allowed versus explicitly allowed, right? Right. If it's explicitly allowed, we say, yep, the code, the ordinance that you want to pass is great. If it's prohibited, we send a legal memo saying the state says you can't get involved in this. Usually the state, just like the federal government, has certain things it takes unto itself and it doesn't delegate those things out. But yeah, I agree with the rest of the code. And I think based on what you read, it's clear to us that you have the powers that are designated to you by yourself or by the state.
And then there's one other important prohibition, which is in, I think it is in Title II. It's Section 2A, limitation of the conduct of the alderman.
Yep.
And that's the one, I think, maybe I'm looking at the wrong one, that says that we cannot direct the work of any of the city staff. We can only go through the city manager. I think it's also been known as the Julie Stankovic rule.
Well, and that comports with the powers you conferred on yourself and those that you delegated, right? So you have the power of planning and zoning, for instance, but you delegated that.
Well, then that's where we need some definition, because I don't see where in the code. So when I look at the definition of the duties of the Director of Planning and Zoning, I don't see a delineation that sets out very clearly what did the council delegate and what did it not delegate. Now,
well, basically, as the part of the code you just read, it says except for planning and zoning, which is delegated. So some point in the past, the code was written to give basically all of planning and zoning to this group, unless you to these groups, unless you decide to take some of it back or all of it back. You ultimately have the decision of planning and zoning because in the main, any disputes could be dealt with by you legislatively. For instance, two people disagree with how planning and zoning works with respect to hearings. And so the council says, okay, that's confusing. We don't like it. So guess what? We're going to change the structure of it. And so now appeals to the Board of Appeals are de novo versus, or on the record versus de novo. So you changed it. You have the authority to change how things work through your legislative, authorizations.
So this came up when Rob and I wanted to do an amendment to a piece of legislation, and I'm struggling to remember what that was, even though it was fairly recent, where we said council members have standing before the quasi-adjudicative bodies. And Ashley sent that back and said, you can do that, but not in this legislation. You have to go back to the charter. And I assume to this very part of the charter, Article 4, Section 2C, and say in there, the council retains the right of standing before the adjudicative bodies. Very simple.
Yeah, it is confusing, but I think that that's probably the correct path, because in order for you to have the powers that you want, you got to go back to your initial power-making words, which are in the charter. The code gives some more detail, but the charter is really where your power-making authority comes from. You give it to yourself out of the state code. And so, yeah, I think it would be better to change the charter and then adjust the code details to match that. But basically, if you want to add more power to the council, or you want to take back planning and zoning authority all to yourself, you can do that, but we need to change the charter.
Well, and I just was reading a resolution that has to do with the Blue Heron condominiums from 1967, where in fact the city council was doing all of that. Right. And the same thing with the information for the South Annapolis Yachting Center, I think. I forget. For the Annapolis City Marina, where we had resolution 50-81, where again, it was the council doing all of that. What's not clear is, you've said we gave it all away. Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. And I don't know, without going through an entire search of the legislative history of when and what we gave away, how you really can make that statement.
Well, you didn't give it away. You delegated it.
We delegated it.
Yeah, basically, you still have it. But in order to change things, there's legislation that you can enact. However, in your delegation, what's important is when you delegate, the delegation stays delegated unless you nullify it by doing things that undercut your delegation. And so you have to be very careful with your activities. For instance, you delegate planning and zoning to part of it is the executive function anyway, as you stated in the code. Drawings, inspections, things like that are part of planning and zoning, which are appropriate for planning and zoning. But the city council could do all of that itself, but generally municipalities arrange themselves so that they don't have to do that work, and council people can legislate. The thing about the executive versus the legislative that we kind of constantly bring up has to do more with protecting legislators from the vagaries of the executive function. The executive function is the one that primarily gets sued or called into court for exercising police powers of the city. It's for that reason that we use the term separation of those powers. The charter and the code separate those powers by providing for them in separate sections. in separate code sections and giving them separate leaders. The council has a leader. The executive function has a leader called the city manager. And so under the city manager, you place duties, functions, powers that you have delegated to that function. And the rest you have retained to yourself, or you have given to other deliberative bodies like commissions and boards who deliberate like you would deliberate if you kept those powers unto yourself.
Right. So I have more, but I see Rob had his hand up.
Yeah.
And I give control back to the chair.
Alderman Savage.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Lyles, for all that information. Because I think, I think a lot of the lines are often blurred. It seems like we aren't really, we don't fit in a clear box right now, or a standard box, it seems, because we're not a full, council manager form of government, and we're also not a complete weak mayor system. And so I think, like I said, those lines could get a little confusing. And one situation that I kind of wanted more information on, and this comes up when I often start working on legislation of my own and look at other jurisdictions, is they do all kind of do things differently. Some of them, as Alderman Arnett stated, have kept the full planning and zoning authority and end up approving projects. And some of them, the councils don't, how do I phrase this? I guess some of them, they're following the state model, right? They pass the equivalent of the statutes, which are the guidance of what you want to see in the regulations, right? And that's where some of the other jurisdictions, like ours, I think, well, maybe ours isn't a good example, but some of them just go ahead and do pass the regulations themselves. For us, it's kind of, we seem to be all over the place. If you look at our code, in some cases we do set the equivalent of a statute, but in other cases we kind of do create the specific regulations. And I guess even the state does that now. I think about it more occasionally too. It blurs that line. Yeah. But I guess I guess moving forward, I'm kind of curious in what direction do we continue to straddle that line, or do we continue to try to go one way or the other? And maybe we do need to continue to straddle the line, because I think we aren't, like I said, we don't fit in any one box for a form of government necessarily. But I am kind of curious what your analysis would be, or guidance to us. I'm sure,
Yeah, I think that you've straddled the line for so long, it's hard to, break some of that habit. And I don't think that I would do that for everything. However, you might note that there are some functions, planning and zoning being one of them, maybe even like parking and trash collection, where the code can be so detailed and must, by necessity, change almost on a dime, that you wonder whether you want all of that, right? Because sometimes the weather could change how we have to deal with the details of parking and trash and inspections of apartments. That the code and legal legislative pronouncements give you the authority to delegate some of that to others, such that they can be nimble in making decisions and providing services to the people. And that if you have to make a decision, you can only basically do it once a month, right? But the problems with city management is that some things happen, in a week, and we need to change it. But if the code doesn't allow you to change it, where the directors and executive staff are on the street actually dealing with that, there could be problems. And so that's where regulation comes into effect. And so I have advocated that some things can be in regulation to help the city staff apply what happens in between ordinances. And maybe it's so unimportant, but important from the standpoint of being nimble, that it should be in a regulation. And we've talked about, and we haven't zeroed in on how to do regulation separate from the code, but a code section that is so detailed as to be kind of a regulation can run you into issues that you probably want to avoid as a council, only because for instance, as what happens with our code, you could be so detailed in something because you knew something in 1995 this is what the state of the world was. But in 2005, the state of the world is different. And now you got to go back into the code, and you may not even have the votes to deal with it, right? But, you know, whether you put the trash out on the curb or in the alley, you know, maybe you just need a staff person to have some regulatory scheme that they can deal with that and change it as the citizens need it changed without having wait a month and get votes, because some things are just part and parcel of what they do on a daily basis. So we suggested that some things need to be, those details need to be in regulation. You do get a chance to review regulations as it's done at the federal level, as Alderman Arnett's aware. If the Congress doesn't like a regulation, they can pull the regulation, change it, vote on it, and put it back, right? If they haven't dealt with it, then the regulation stays. And what you want to do is provide for public comment, and you want to have a way for the public to say, yeah, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. You want to have a hearing on it at the staff level. And if everybody agrees, then it and the council doesn't have any problem with it, then it becomes part of the regulatory code or regulatory scheme.
Yeah, and that makes sense that sometimes we may want some, by the nature of whatever the regulations are, would require more detail than others. And I think in some cases we've had situations where the laws that have been passed, not necessarily by this particular makeup of the council, but others that just haven't been detailed enough. And that, you know, staff ends up scratching their heads wondering which way to go. And so that's where I think the regulation comes into play. But then the other question I'd have would be, is we don't necessarily seem to have a body, and maybe that should come out of law office or somewhere else. But anyway, some kind of person or body that reviews in those situations the regulations that come out of the statutes, to make sure that the regulations kind of not just comply with the statute, but meet the intent of the council. And I think that would be the council. So the council would review it. You wouldn't have to necessarily vote on it, again, to make it nimble, unless you thought there was a problem with it. And then you would call it up. It would go to requisite committee and get to the council for a vote. Hey, we like this resolution. We like this legislation or regulation, I'm sorry. Or here are the changes we would have to it. And then you send it back to the agency for its effect in the real world. So you always have the opportunity, the council always have the opportunity to do what it needs to do with regulations. This is just an idea or suggestion I had about how to manage getting regulations as part of the laws that we have. And regulation is and will have the force and effect of law. It just won't be something the council has to vote on a monthly basis in order to get it implemented. Mostly be directed by staff. But the council always has the ability to say, hey, that regulation is garbage. Let's do away with that, or to change it, or to review it. My suggestion would be to do that kind of in a non-confirming way. So it will pass plus comment and review if the council doesn't do anything. Yeah, and maybe that's kind of also a question for I'll stop here, Madam Chair. Also a question for the city manager, because the city manager is tasked with that office with implementing the regulations, the statutes, the law that we pass. And so I guess that's often something we can at any time bring up with that office if we have.
And technically you have regulations now. Because if the city staff has to fill in the blanks, those actually become regulations. We just probably don't call them regulations. You might call them rules, right? Sometimes practices. We call them regulations. We call them policies. And city staff daily fills those blanks in order to get the job done, right? So if we're going to have city trash cans, the city will buy them and give them out, and they're all blue. That's a policy. It's a regulation, right? And the city trash can will not be other than blue. So the city staff figured that out, and now that's what it is. So those things are our regulations, and we just have to assemble them in the same place probably, and actually have a more formal mechanism for public comment mostly to make sure that they make sense, and to have you have an overall aerial view of them in a way that is positive and constructive. Because right now, there are a lot of policies that are called regulations you don't ever see because we don't have a regulatory scheme. We don't have a regulatory policy that directs them to you. So you might not ever see it unless somebody has a problem with it, right?
I see Director or City Manager Gerald's with us. Mr. Gerald?
Yeah, thank you. So just to get back to what Alderman Savage was saying, and he knows this very well because he's had lots of experience, but we have subject matter experts in all these areas. And you know, we all hear over and over, but that's the way we've always done it, right? and those are those little rules that we all have and that we all operate by. And they're not always the best necessarily, but that's the way it's always been done. And so that's the way it continues to be done. But when we do have questions, then we always consult with the city attorney's office. And you know, if there's a legal aspect to it, then we get their input and adjust as needed to make sure that we're doing it legally. But there are all kinds of those common practices of you know, the ways that we have done in the past and continue to do it.
So let me ask a question. Is there a breakdown in the staff reporting part of this, of the legislation? When something comes to us, because I've heard over and over, you know, it's lacking details oftentimes when we, you know, approve an ordinance and then we give it to staff to implement and they have a different interpretation maybe. Is there room for our staff reports to be more precise or to give the staff itself an opportunity to weigh in, to tell us ahead of time what might be missing? Does that make any sense?
If I can add to that or answer that initially, David might have some comments. One of the issues we run into with respect to staff reports is that until recently, and the council's been very good, and we thank you for your discipline in this regard, we would get ordinance proposals the night before the council meeting, or the week before the council meeting, or the Friday before the council meeting. And so, in my view, one of the things we like to do, and I like to make sure Jacqueline Lee does, is send ordinances to staff so we can get some comments, because part of the thing that we have to do in language is make it something that can be implemented, right? So if a council, what comes out of a council person's mind has to fit on paper and has to be actionable, and for the most part has to be a police action, something that if you don't do it, something happens. So we have to, the implementers are staff, so they have to tell us, oh yeah, that we can do that, or that can't be done, or we don't do that unless we get a whole nother person to do that thing. So we do get staff comments, but until recently, we were dealing with getting these, you know, with pretty quick turnaround, and staff didn't have an opportunity to give maybe more in-depth research on some of those things. But we're doing a lot better now. I appreciate it.
And I would just add that the staff reports sort of impose that discipline on the staff to think through what the legislation is, because the staff reports generally are prepared by the department that's going to be responsible for whatever the change is, right? I mean, I do a few of them, but most of the more complicated ones are done by the departments that are going to be responsible. So that forces them to think through what the legislation is and to ask questions, because you'll see that sometimes, or propose amendments or changes to the legislation to improve it. So I think that system of having the staff reports done and allowing us time to do those staff reports is really helpful.
I think Alderwoman Finlayson has touched on something different that I hear from the staff all the time, and that is that our legislation does not have good quality standards and criteria. I'm thinking of APF as a classic example of that, where it's very hard to know what the legislative intent was and what the standards are because it wasn't in the code. And I think, Mr. Lyles, that's where you and Joel have said, well, it probably shouldn't be in the code. We should really probably do that level of detail in regulations. And I'm fine with that, although we do have to change Title II because right now that's not permitted. And also, I think we have to have a more regularized way of regulations being promulgated, where there's a notice and it becomes law if there's no objection by the council in particular or from the public. And there's a whole rigorous process at the federal level for doing that. And as you say, if the council doesn't object at the time, but they find later on there's some problem, we always have the legislative prerogative coming back and working with the staff and making corrections. So I like the direction that you and Joel are heading with this. I just think we need to get it more formalized and get the code Title II revised to let us do it. And then I think, David, all the things that you're referring to, that's the way we've always done it. We just need to make sure that's codified. There has to be some way that the public, when they want to know what the rules and procedures are, can go out to our website or someplace and say, oh, here's the rules and regulation for what I have to do. And we, again, came into that with the APF stuff where some of the stuff was notice was given. In fact, all of it apparently, but 10 years ago, but some of it wasn't. And so that's a more rigorous activity on our part. There's two other big issues that I wanted to have, and maybe we won't get time to get to both of them at this meeting, Madam Chair, but I did want to talk about the things that came up in the budget for the goals and objectives, which for the Office of Law was the goal and objective to revise the charter and the code, which is something that I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people do, but I do think it's bad enough that there's a lot of work that we need to do there. But I want to talk about the process and the guideline and the partnership in that process. But the other thing that I think is more urgent is what's coming up with the Board of Appeals and the Port Wardens. And that is, I don't think we have a well-defined or rigorous system of checks and balances. At the federal level, where you have really three branches, but certainly two branches, executive and legislative, it's very clear that there are checks and balances established. There are all kinds of congressional review commissions and so on and so forth that will oversee what the federal branch is doing and so on. In my view, that whole standing of the alderpersons and getting involved with things at the Port Warden level or the Board of Appeals is the check and balance. There is no other check or balance called for in our city form of government, in our city code. I suspect we may not totally agree on that, Mr. City Attorney, but I think that's something where I really do think we need to have some dialogue. So I'll just give a kind of a made-up example, but what if we observe one of the adjudicative bodies not following the code, and it isn't called by the Office of Law staff assigned to it, or by the staff, the city staff that's assigned to it, but the alderperson sees that the code is not being followed? How do we call that into question? Other than writing legislation, which is, as you know, a long, elaborate process, and the issue at hand is long since gone by the wayside, one way or the other. But it does seem that we have a checks and balance role, and I'll return to that part under our powers and duties, where we conduct oversight of expenditures and delivery of services. And that seems to me to imply we have a fiduciary obligation to pay attention to how the city is performing. Now, that's an enormous task, and of course we couldn't ever do it, probably wouldn't want to do it, but when some fairly egregious things pop up And I could give you some many specifics right now, but I don't want to do that. Where is the role for the council to say, no, that's not what we passed. That's not our legislative intent. Yeah. That's not being done the way it's supposed to be done.
Right. Well, Alderman Arnett, we agree. You and I agree about this.
I thought we did.
Your power and authority comes with legislation. For instance, because part of the code section that maybe a port warden decision is relying on is not maybe detailed enough, maybe not even written correctly, right? The intention sometimes of the council gets perverted by the people like me who write it, right? So how do we overcome that? The council has to look at it and agree that what you intended is on that page.
All right, so I'll give you a specific example because that's not what I'm talking about. The Port Wardens has gotten into the habit of issuing permits without consideration of the lateral lines. Consideration of lateral lines is specifically called for in Title 15. It's there for the protection of all of the property owners along the shoreline. And for them to say, we're going to issue the permit without considering lateral lines, who does consider lateral lines then?
Okay,
I mean, that to me is a very clear abrogation of what they're supposed to be considering under Title 15.
So what the council can do is to amend the code so that it says just that. The port warden shall not ever pass a ruling or issue a ruling that does not consider lateral lines.
No, see, that's just too minute. I think what is implied in the code is the port wardens will follow the code. And when they don't follow the code, when we talk about lateral lines in the code, I think that it is reasonable to assume that the port wardens will take up and adjudicate the issue of the lateral lines. And when you see them now in the habit of saying, we're not going to do that, what do? We write a code saying you have to follow the code? I think that is
first of all, it's not in front of me, so I can't say with any
I know, and that's why I didn't want to get into specifics, but where you were going.
Right, but I would say
we can write a general law that says you have to follow the code explicitly, everybody, when you're doing adjudication. But if they choose not to do it, how does that mean anything?
Yeah, you've got a couple of prerogatives. One is to review what they're doing and then change the rules, the code, so that they're doing it correctly. It may be that it needs more definition. Secondly, you can change the people on it, right? So when folks are coming on and off, you've got to make sure that people who you interview to be on these boards and commissions actually understand their role and what they're doing. And then thirdly, if it's something that we can handle in the Office of Law, I mean, you can send us the concern, and maybe we can write a legal opinion about it that would help them be put on the right track by a forceful legal opinion. But we can talk.
That one came to your office this morning. I sent it to Sally.
Okay.
Kevin.
Yeah, we'll do a legal opinion and
pass it on to you.
We'll do a legal opinion, and the opinion would go back to you. I mean, we could talk about it, but there may be a range of options that are within your authority that we could do so that the whole thing doesn't come crashing right today. But the council can decide, well, the port wardens isn't working anymore, and we don't want to do that process, and we want all of it back to us. I mean, the council has that kind of authority as well. So there's a range. We want to take it back because the port wardens, we just can't get the right people with the right experience. Or let's go to the Office of Law, get a legal opinion, and let that legal opinion serve as the direction for the port wardens, broadly. Not only particular issue.
I don't want that.
Let me ask a question. Mr. Lyles,
first of all, Mr. Gottlieb is doing a great job as port warden, has for decades. So I'm not impugning, but they have gotten into this habit of doing that. And I think there has to be some kind of checks and balances that when the council becomes aware that the code is not being followed, that we get the code to be followed. And it doesn't mean write legislation that says follow the code. I think that's pretty implicit.
Well, but implicit, the implicit may not be the way you want to go. It may be that you need something more explicit, because people, 10 people can read the same word differently, and it may be that the code needs to be written in a way that is more direct.
Thought there was only
let me ask a question. Mr. Lyles, are you saying that if a board, in this case, does not follow the responsibility as outlined in our code, there is no easier mechanism for correcting that behavior? Could there not simply be a letter to them from the law department outlining exactly what their responsibilities are and acknowledging that they are not fulfilling the mission of the code?
Yeah, I mean, you could do that, but we'd have to really be clear on exactly what the issue is, because a memorandum or legal opinion from the Office of Law may not be the right tool for every situation. So it would mean we have to go into your toolkit and determine what would be right for the particular instance that you're giving us. So it is a tool, we can do it, but here's the thing. What if they decide that they don't want to abide by that, right? By the legal opinion, and whose responsibility is it then? One of the things that we've had to do, or we've done in the last year, is hire for some of the boards and commissions outside legal counsel who can, counsel them and keep some of the boards and commissions on track legally. And that's been very helpful, because the attorneys that we've hired have some facility and experience with boards and commissions. And that's been helpful. The other thing we can do as an Office of Law is to, help when we are involved in a case as a party representing the city. We can actually file motions, and we could even go to court, depending on how deep we wanted to get with a particular decision. But I think the council has to think long and hard about which tool it would use in any particular circumstance, and we stand ready to help you figure that out. But no, it doesn't have to be hard in all cases, right? It just depends on the recalcitrance of the particular board members in any particular situation.
I kind of agree with you,
Alderman
Sheila.
Savage has
I agree with you, Sheila.
I'm sorry, Rob.
I'm in sympathy with what I think you're saying. We can't go back and follow the code, and particularly since these things have real-time consequences, permits are being issued that have impacts on people right then. They can't wait for a 6-month process where we go back and say you didn't follow the code. I do think that there needs to be checks and balances, and maybe our charter doesn't clearly call for that, although I think there is room for it in Article 1 here with our powers and duties. But I think every political organization, governmental organization, needs a system of checks and balances. And I think it's missing in our form of government, or our practice of government here. There's not.
Alderman Savage has been trying to get in here. Sorry, Alderman.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I do think we need to, discuss more about how that check could happen. I do think it's important to have, but I do think Mr. Lyles has outlined, I think the opinion is certainly one avenue, and a relatively soft approach. I think that would make sense. But in some cases, I could see a situation where, and I think in some cases it's as easy as going to, if it was staff and not a commission, just going to the city manager and having a discussion. But I've had some instances myself where I tend to disagree with how certain regulations are being applied, and so I think it is, admittedly, I think a struggle at times to try to figure out exactly the best approach, especially if there isn't any kind of authority above us to make in terms of the state, to help us clarify things. And I guess is that, and in some cases, I think that would be appropriate. It sounds like to have the law office to be assisting us with. but I guess if all those parties disagree and it's just the council, our only recourse, it sounds like, at least currently, is to just pass clarifying legislation. But then again, I mean, that's also something I've said before, is I think it's important to make sure that we, what's the use of passing more laws if what we have on the books aren't necessarily being applied correctly. And so, I think it is a very important conversation to have about how do we ensure proper implementation.
Yeah, we're open to whatever tools you want to use, but I think there would be different tools depending on the situation.
I think it's important to let the council know what the options are, what all the tools are, because they vary. There was a situation with the Education Commission just last month where some of the members were overstepping the boundaries of the commission and got into personnel issues. And Ashley wrote, I want to say an opinion, but I'm not sure it rose to the level of an opinion, but she wrote a statement or a letter saying, that you're overstepping your boundaries, in other words. And that was sufficient for that setting, at least so far. I'm knocking on wood here.
Yeah, you do have a lot of tools. And so it is a range of things, everything from removal of a chair or parties on the board because they just don't want to do what the code says. And that may be appropriate, all the way to a memorandum opinion from the Office of Law, or resolution or ordinance changing the law or amending it so that it's clear and the direction is clear. And it could be a resolution, it could be a letter from us, or it could be letters from yourselves. There's a range, and we think all those tools are available to you. It just depends on the situation at hand.
Well, in addition to making the council aware of what tools we have available to us, I think it's important to make the volunteers who are on these boards and commissions aware of what their limitations are.
Well, and we have a situation, Alderwoman, where we, as the Office of Law, can't advise every board and commission because we might be representing the department, right? So we hire outside counsel. So a lot of them are being brought along with legal advice that may not, in the past, have been ours, or by outside counsel that might not have been properly educated on how boards and commissions work. So they were reluctant to kind of advise appropriately a commission or board. And so our boards and commissions that we directly advise are going to do everything possible to adhere to the code. Those boards and commissions that do not have us and maybe have outside counsel or no counsel, we may be having some issues with as they adjust to a new paradigm with respect to their activity.
I just think there should be there should be a mechanism as part of their training for their work on the boards and commissions, so they are aware of what their limitations are and what the repercussions are if they go beyond their boundaries.
And we're planning that training now. And we were planning it before COVID started, and it kind of hampered our ability to have the training that we wanted for all of the boards and commissions and all of the volunteers. But it is still being planned, and we're looking at a date to train each board and commission over the next several months. So we are going to do that.
Okay. Alderman Arnett?
So, Madam Chair, I don't know where we are in terms of our time allotment. I do want to get back to this discussion charter and the code. I think that that's something we definitely need to do, but I do want to talk about what the parameters. But I want to interject right now a question that Alderman Gay put to me today, and I think the answer to that could address some of the many issues we're talking about here. He was looking at the Baltimore City Council and noticed that they have a book of rules and procedures for the Baltimore City Council. And he asked me, could I tell him where he can get our copy of City Council rules and procedures? And I said, good question. I don't think we have that. And frankly, I think that if we did have that, if we put it together, just like boards and commissions have rules and procedures, that a lot of these gray area issues that we're talking about here in terms of our powers and duties and processes, Robert's rules, all of these things that are swirling around could actually get codified and make us think about them and maybe even follow the rules and procedures. What a concept. But I don't think we do have it. I think you can pluck out parts of the code, like the rules on establishing standing committees and the rules on quorums and the rules on votes at council meetings and the rules on the nature of the council meetings. It's a lot of it is in the code, but it's not pulled out as a binder that has the city council rules and procedures. And I think that's going to be a pretty daunting task to do, but I think it may well be one that's worth doing.
Alderman, I recall at the beginning of the last term that Alderwoman Charles gave out binders. I'm sure, Alderman Savage, you have yours right close to you right now.
Saturdays are for pajamas and answering phone calls. Yeah, I remember that.
And so I think that there was an effort at the beginning of each new term that the members be made aware of at least some things. I assume that our work session on Thursday, the portion that deals with the ethics, was one of those tools that we need to be made aware of. I think it's off the agenda, but I just assumed that was a briefing for us to remind us of the restrictions we have as far as ethical or unethical issues, really. I could be wrong, that really is not what it is about, but you're right. There are some things that we are made aware of and some things we aren't. All right. Is that all of your questions for Mr. Lyles?
Well, I do want to talk, but I suggest it might not be for this meeting, and it may well be for a finance committee meeting also, because I remember the last time we revised just Title 21, and that was in 2004. That was done by a huge contract. And so taking on the entirety of the code and the entirety of the charter, I think Mr. Lyles and Joelle are up to the task. I just think they probably need to have a few hours each night for sleep in addition to doing that. But I also think we ought to be partnering on that. I think that is very clearly a legislative role. And I have some ideas. I bet we all have some ideas on what could be done to make the charter and the code better. This whole idea of taking things out of the code and putting it into regulation and making the code one volume instead of two big fat volumes is certainly one that's worthy of discussion. We have all kinds of missing, code. The Title 9 and Title 19 don't exist in our code. There's the title number, but there's nothing there. And the same thing, there's parts of the charter where, and I was just noticing something today where something was removed from one section and put into another. So there's a huge amount of just cleanup work, but I think more importantly, substantive revision and updating of the code and the charter. And I do want to have a chat to talk about, particularly with this committee, how we partner going forward with the Office of Law and the rest of the departments on getting that tweaked up.
Mr. Lyles, can you tell us, what are you changing your background colors to see what looks best?
No, I just think it's the lighting here in my house.
You go red to blue to yellow.
Yeah, I think if I move,
the blue is good though.
I think it's the TV I'm watching, CNN. So,
is there something happening tonight?
Have they announced?
No, I think it's a family. I'm in between Family Feud episodes. So.
I forgot what I was going to ask you now. Can you tell us what your strategy is for rewriting the charter, the code?
Well, mostly the strategy was going to come with us having a discussion about it. Interestingly enough, before I came, you had already, as a council, decided that changes were coming. So, and we've got some legislation that we're reviewing and helping Department of Planning and Zoning right now on Title 10. And I think there has been some work on 21 and some other titles. So this is an ongoing project. But one of the things that we wanted to do was to put in our resource base in front of you from a budgetary standpoint, was to put it in front of you. It's less, we will do this now, and more, we know we have to do it. The council is involved in doing it, and it takes more hands than we have. And so I wanted to have a placeholder for you so that we could have a discussion about it more so than I have a plan, because I don't have a plan right now, but we are in the middle of doing some of the changes that I saw when I first came in that were happening. And I just think that they need to be happening on a more regularized, consistent basis. So as we start to change things wholesale, we're looking at all parts of the code. And from a resource standpoint, I may not be resourced appropriately to deal with it wholesale, but we are doing it piecemeal. And hopefully we're doing a good job as we look at all parts of the code that have to be relatedly changed.
Can you share with us as you're approaching different sections so that the council can have share with you ideas or concerns that we may have had on a different section, each section, as you're picking a piece of the code to deal with? It might be helpful to hear from the council what we already see wrong with it, since many of us have been dealing with this for a much longer time.
Right. I don't have a plan of my own yet, and hopefully I will develop that. But right now, we've been carrying out the changes that were already in play, right? And so those are coming. You're going to get a Title 10 rewrite, and we're involved with drafting that now. So I'm assuming, because it was started before me, that it's something you'd already looked at, but you will begin to see the changes to that. It's coming out of planning and zoning. And there may be, and you've got a charter commission coming up as well this year that will review the charter. So that hopefully would be a good launching off point for our work as a consistent, regularized review of every section that needs to have some tightening up. Not all of it's substantive. Some of it is just unclear, and we just need to make it clear. But the Charter Commission may be a good jumping off point for that.
As in those dreaded words, and certain stylistic changes?
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Well, I would, Madam Chair, I think this has been a very productive discussion. I want to thank the city attorney, but I do think it would be good to start having regular discussions like this. I think we scratched the surface, but I think a lot more we need to get into.
Okay. Mr. Lyles, thank you for joining us. You're free to stick around, but No
problem. I appreciate it. I saw on your agenda you had only the 2 items or the 1 item substantive. I think you're good to go. If you need me, I'll be around. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
So the next item is under legislation R1720, annual statement of performance standards. And I assume this came from the mayor. I see Ms. Farrow. She wrote the staff report. So Ms. Farrow, do you want to speak to this document? Were you responsible for writing it or making changes?
No. Well, each department developed the performance measures for themselves, and my role was to put them all together, make sure they, met the criteria that the city manager set out, working back and forth with each department. So no, but I did not write them myself. So yeah.
Alderman Savage.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask: is this on the agenda because we postponed it, or have the standards been updated? Because it looks like it's. I don't see a newer version posted, so I'm guessing we just postponed it.
Yes, that's why.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So there's.
Yeah.
Mr. Gerald, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, these have been around for a while now because these actually predate me. So we've had a lot of discussions about these. Alderman Arnett and I have had fairly lengthy discussions of these. These are work in progress. I think when these were developed, that the departments did them without adequate training, frankly. And so Ms. Farrow did a wonderful job trying to pull them all together. They were very, very much different from each other. And we tried to make them all parallel and addressing the same, so that the measures and the standards were fairly consistent and addressed what we wanted to. But we're not there yet, and we recognize that. They still need work. This is a resolution, so they're going to be updated and resubmitted again for this next year. So at this point, rather than completely updating these like they need to be, I guess I would ask that you either just accept these or approve them, and then we'll move on and get some better ones submitted in the future during the next round. We want to get a consultant, and we want to get some training for the departments in preparing these. We want to make it much better and more consistent than they are currently, and we acknowledge that. And I think that's why it's taken so long, because they're just not quite there yet. So each of the council committees that's reviewed them, I think, have sensed that and not especially been willing to approve them as is, because they're not quite there yet. But we'll do better next time.
So, Mr. Gerald, do you think it would be appropriate to label this as a draft and to approve it as a draft, which would suggest that it is a work in progress?
Well, I think that's the addition that we submitted for this year. It's a resolution. We owe you annual performance updates, and so I think that's the one that was submitted. Instead of going back and revising that and submitting it again for this year, I would just say just accept it as is, knowing that there's going to be better ones coming in the future.
Okay, Alderman Arnett.
So I would resist that only to the extent that this is the backbone of the budget process now, and in here still is the no longer existing Office of Environmental Policy. So it does seem to me that we need to take that out, and we need to redistribute some of those duties and sections that are staying with the new deputy city manager and Racine. So I think at a minimum, it would be very complicated to use this as part of the budget without making that correction. And I think that then brings up the notion that we don't have maybe we do. Do we have something in here for the city managers? I don't think we do have performance measures for the city manager. I would also note we don't have performance measures for the city council. And I think maybe we ought to be what's good for the goose is good for the gander kind of thing. But also, I think critically missing here, and what I will profess to be a great mystery to me, is what is it that the mayor's staff does? I mean, I have no idea what their assignments are and what they're doing. And it does seem to me they're part of the budget and they do have duties. We have expectations from them, like liaison to the African American community, liaison to the Hispanic community, the ombudsman, all of those things. And it just feels to me that if we're going to have the system, it ought to be a full system. I would note that the old Excel system that we had, get the glare off of there, for years and years that many people are familiar with, we did have performance measures for the mayor's office. And we'd never have had it for the city council, but I think that falls right in line with the discussion we just had about the city council not having a code of rules and procedures. I think if we would start delineating some of these things, and heaven forbid, measure performance, we could get better performance from all of these bodies. So I certainly could not vote to pass this the way it is submitted. I think at a minimum, we have to take out functions we know no longer exist and reassign those duties. I did have a long meeting with City Manager Gerald and Assistant City Manager Farrow, and I thought a very productive one. I owe them, because I'd made notes all over my thing, I owe them a Xerox copy because I can't figure out how to scan on my printer of my comments for whatever they're worth. And they're considerable, and I think that there's a lot of things we know that are in here as measures that aren't measures. There's still a lot of improvements, as the city manager said. That's not going to happen between now and the budget. And so I would suggest that this committee offer some amendments if we're going to go ahead and move forward with this legislation. And I do think that was the reason for the 90-day postponement, was to give everybody more time to go back and give this the serious attention that I believe it warrants. And I do think that we shouldn't minimize the effort that Lynn went through to take a lot of stuff and cobble it together and make it as coherent as it is now. But I would then say we still have more work to do to make this a productive document.
Well, Alderman, you've heard the city manager indicate that this is a work in progress. So, and you seem to have a list of concerns about this. So can you prepare the amendments that you want to see to correct those inadequacies?
I would be happy to do that. So to that end, I would move we postpone consideration of this resolution until our next meeting, the beginning of next month, at which time I will have a whole list of amendments for your consideration, and I'll share them with the city manager, assistant city manager, and I will prepare them at least a week in advance of the next meeting.
May I ask Manager Gerald, this isn't time sensitive, I assume? There's no urgency? Or yes?
I agree with Alderman Arnett that the budget is based on that. So this ideally would inform the budget decisions that the directors are making. So in that way it is. Are we going to get it done prior to the start of the budget, which is probably going to be in December or January? Probably not, because this is going to take a lot of work by the departments to revamp this.
Alderman Savage?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that I think there's some tweaks that would need to be made before I'd be comfortable supporting it. And I think it should be tweaked just to adjust the current organizational structure, but also some of the environmental programs, which I thought were kind of left out and not mentioned in there, I think will be important to include. And I don't think it would take too long to develop some metrics. But I do think I'd rather have that come from staff, the appropriate staff, in their words and view, as opposed to coming from me. But because they know their programs best. And I guess I don't know, city manager, do you think that's something that could be adjusted in this via amendments?
I think Director Govt actually drafted up some additional ones that are more citywide for resilience and environmental and sustainability. So I think we should at least include those. I thought that they had been added, but they seem to drop out in the versions that come to you. So we need to make sure that those are included, because I think those were pretty good measures. Yeah, well, and in particular, there's the no mention of the sediment control program or the enforcement program in public works, and there's no mention of the forest conservation program in planning and zoning. And I think I'd like to see some focus given to those, even if it's just a few metrics to show that those departments are focusing on those programs.
Mr. Gerald, will the changes come to us in the form of recommended amendments?
We can certainly do that, yes. I think that would be the best form as amendments.
And Alderman Savage, would you work with the Environmental Policy Office to make sure that your concerns are addressed in their proposed amendment?
I'd be happy to, yeah.
I thought, Rob, that those were amendments that the Environmental Matters Committee already suggested. Didn't we do that?
We did suggest them, but we didn't recommend specific language. So, but again, I think that, and I think if the environmental, if the new position and the city manager's office is going to help with that, I think that would be great. But again, I do think these departments need to have some, include these environmental programs in their specific performance measures.
Okay, there's a motion that's been placed on the floor. It didn't get a second. Alderman Savage, are you willing to second the postponement of action on this legislation?
Yes, I'll second that.
Okay, further discussion? So we understand what is going to happen next. Alderman Arnett is going to bring some amendments, and I assume we'll get amendments from the staff through the city manager. And I just heard you say the Environmental Matters Committee has amendments that maybe we can look at and consider at the same time.
Didn't the Transportation Committee also have, I thought Ellie had a couple of amendments. I'll try to take on the responsibility, David and Lynn, to corral input from the other committees and get some things to you and this committee as quickly as I can. But I hope we can get that taken care of at the next Rules Committee in time for the legislative session, the first meeting in December.
And the other thing is that the audit committee is just now taking up this legislation, and they're getting presentations from each of the departments on their performance measures. So that's going to be a fairly long process. It's a good thing. I think that's an appropriate function for the audit committee, but it's just going to take a little bit of time, and it's starting late.
Yep. Takia had something.
Green.
I just wanted to say, I don't know if Alderwoman Tierney had amendments, but the only committees that it went to was this one and Environmental Matters.
Oh, all right. I'm misunderstood. I'll talk to her anyway.
Okay. Further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of postponing action on R1720, please say aye.
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 Okay. Thank you very much. It looks like that finishes our agenda. Is there anything else for the good of the order?
Go blue.
Absolutely. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
Second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody.
Mr. Darrell. Thank you, Ms. Green. Thank you, Mr. Jakes. Thank you, Ms. Farrell.
Thank you.